In I-24 News senior correspondent Owen Alterman joining me live in studio to break all of this down. Owen, good afternoon to you. The Israeli political playing field always shifting, always changing. Walk us through these events that have been happening just in the last couple of days.
Yeah, Hamdah, a micro drama, if you will. But because our elections have been so close over the last 4 cycles, and the expectation is that it'll be close again, every little bit counts, as the cliche goes. And that's why there's so much attention being given to this. So let's step back and explain. Last Thursday night, the deadline for registering your lists for the election, that's the deadline for parties to merge and parties to split. At the 11th hour, in this case, there was a split. These are 3 parties who had run together in the past election cycle, and we're expected to do the same today. It was understood that they were in this cycle. It was understood they were in negotiations, but Hamdah, the working assumption was that at the end of the day, they both lose by not doing a deal, so that somehow they would get to yes. Lo and behold, they did not, and filed 2 separate lists, Hadash and Tal on one list, in a bit of a crude generalizing terms, more moderate parties in Israeli speak, and Balad with a more stringent, a more strident nationalist voice, deciding to run on its own. Balad would seem to be almost assured of not making the threshold. They on their own are not going to be able to get the 3.25% of the vote, which means that anyone who casts a vote for Balad, those votes will essentially be thrown in the trash. And what that means is, by the math, it helps Netanyahu and the Netanyahu bloc. Why? Those votes would be votes that, if they were counted, would not be part of the Netanyahu bloc. Because they are not counted, the Netanyahu bloc is helped. And as you just mentioned in your lead, and you're absolutely right, it's not for certain that Hadash and Tal on their own can clear the 3.25% bar so that votes for those parties count. For that matter, Ram has been around that threshold over the course of this election cycle and the previous election cycle as well. Point being, there is a risk here, because of these parties running as 3 lists and not for 2, an enhanced risk of votes being wasted. In the case of Balad, it's an virtual certainty. And again, it's not a huge percent of the vote, right? Balad is polling, according to the polls over the weekend, around 1% of the vote, in some cases even less. So it's not a lot of votes that are going to be thrown out. But again, because these elections are so close, even that small a number of votes that are going to be thrown in the trash could potentially decide the entire election, which is why it's getting a lot of attention here in Israel.
If we could have the control room put the polls back up on the screen for our viewers to see. Let's talk about the Netanyahu bloc. The Israeli channels over the weekend saying that his bloc would have 60 seats, just one short of a majority. Who do we see joining his bloc?
Well, listen, first, two important notes about the polls. These are, of course, polls. They have margins of error. They're not precise. We don't know if the actual result were an election to be held. The pollsters can't tell you, Hamdah, if the Netanyahu bloc's going to get 60 seats, 61 seats, or 59. They're not going to get 55, and they're not going to get 65, okay? But there is obviously a margin of error. That's number one. Number two, if you look at these 3 polls, one next to the other, and 3 of them next to each other, you see the numbers are almost identical. To me, that raises a red flag. Is this a case of pollsters herding, right? Pollsters getting results that are far from the mean, the pollster being worried that they're going to be seen as unusual, that they're making a mistake, and so making an assumption that brings their poll closer to what viewers would expect. And if that's the case, and this happens frequently in polling from what you read as pollsters explain their work, this could mean that all of the polls could, in a sense, be wrong. Although we have to say, over the course of these 5 election cycles, overall, Israeli pollsters have a fairly good record. Listen, the game is on to try to get to 61. It's been the game over all of these cycles. It's very, very close. Again, whether Netanyahu actually has the 60 seats in the poll or slightly more, slightly less, it's very, very close. That's not new. That's why the story of Balad is so important, because it's about 1% of the vote that would have been counted against the Netanyahu bloc and is now going to be thrown in the garbage, essentially helping them. So that is why it's important, and the polls, as you put them up on the screen, you look at them, really bring that point home, because you see before your eyes just how very, very close our elections, as always, are.
Let's talk also very quickly and finally about the interim Prime Minister, Yair Lapid. How realistic is the cooperation between him and these Arab parties like Hadash Ta'al after the election?
Well, first of all, with Ram, as we know, Hamdah, Mansour Abbas has been very vocal. This is his message to his voters, and he's been said it loudly and clearly in the last election cycle. In this one, he'd be happy to go inside the government. In this case, maybe even taking ministries, he hinted. So that's in terms of Ram. As for Hadash and Tal, it's much more complicated. What they have essentially said is they are not interested in being part of the government and doing what Ram did, right? Being part of the government, having to support it in votes in the parliament, certainly not taking ministries. But they might be willing to go to the president after Election Day and recommend that Lapid be given the opportunity to form a government, which could, on the margins, help Lapid be able to do so. They say they will only do that in return, in exchange for something from Lapid, some kind of promise, some kind of commitment to give them something they want. All part of the political game. We'll have to see how it plays out after November 1st, but it's all going to depend on the numbers and whether Netanyahu gets to 61 or not.
I-24 News senior correspondent Owen Alterman joining me live in studio this afternoon to break down the Israeli political playing field. Thank you.